Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and the video this week is going to be a little bit different. So last night I was going through videos on YouTube and I happened across a video by the creator Merlin, and he was talking about Jorge Luis Borges' short story, The Library of Babel. And in a nutshell, the Library of Babel is meant to be a library that's kind of infinitely expansive and contains every single 410-page book that could ever be. And he conceptualized of this library as a bunch of different hexagonal rooms where 4 of the walls of that hexagon are covered with bookshelves. And then there's a bathroom door on one of the walls and then also a sleeping closet on the other wall. And then there's a hole in the center of the room floor and then also a hole in the ceiling so that you can see through to the hexagons above and the hexagons below. And there are an infinite expanse of all of these different hexagons. And the idea is that these books contain every combination of characters that's possible across all languages, including punctuation marks and spaces. And that way, most of the books in this library are going to be total gibberish nonsense that aren't going to have anything intelligible about them at all. But because it represents every single 410-page book that could ever exist, that means that every single piece of writing that's less than 410 pages could exist within this library and does exist within this library. So all of the works of Shakespeare exist within this library. Your biography from birth to death exists within this library. The story of how the dinosaurs went extinct exists within this library. And likewise, all sorts of slightly erroneous versions of these books also exist, where there's just one character difference. So if you could imagine the book War and Peace exists within this library, as well as War and Peace with just one letter difference. And so there's also just an expansive amount of all of these books that could exist where they're just slightly different. But again, like I said, most of the books in this library are just combinations of random letters and, random spaces and random punctuation marks. And because of the random way that these books have been put together, their function is fundamentally useless. So let's say that you find something that's totally coherent, like some kind of history of the world. Just because it's coherent doesn't mean that it actually contains any real information in it, because it's just a collection of letters that happen to be organized in that particular way. And in the story, because this library exists, there comes to be different groups and factions of people who relate to the library in different ways. Like there's a group of people that are called purifiers that seek to destroy every meaningless book in the library. So all the books in the library that are just a collection of random gibberish, they're trying to throw in the fire. And it's because they have a sense that, if you have all of these useless books, it kind of it muddies the waters. It's like you can't really use anything in the library. And there's even a belief among some of the purifiers that they're going to find the ultimate book, which is the index of all books within the library. And they even posit that there's a man of the book that has seen this infinite book and that contains all of the information within the library. And so you see kind of some quasi-religious things kind of popping up within this short story. And in a sense, it's very reflective of how we relate to the infinite expanses of everything. There's so much knowledge out there, and it's like trying to find the knowledge that's actually meaningful, trying to find the information that's going to be meaningful. And that's really a driving force behind creating philosophies and religions and cosmologies. Now, the reason why I wanted to bring up this book is because it really strikes a chord with me, and it's reflective of a strong fear that I have, probably my greatest fear. And it's actually come up in my medicine journey, something similar to this Library of Babel, and I wanted to talk about it a little bit. So first off, just as a concept, I think it is a brilliant concept, and you can really chew on that concept quite a lot to be able to discover what your feelings are and what your relationship is with infinity, and also just in the social media age where there's so much content that's being created every single moment, and there's this infinite expanse of knowledge. It's just this inundation with all this knowledge, and some of it's not even useful. Some of it's just random things that people are coming up with. And so I think this story really strikes at the heart of the terror of living in the information age, where there's such a saturation of images and text and other types of content. Now, in terms of how this has come up for me in my medicine journeys, first I have to give a little bit of a preface about, sort of a complex that I've had ever since I was a small child, which is to be always looking for more and more and more truth, more and more and more information. Like there's an underlying understanding that I have to somehow know things perfectly, and I have to discover things perfectly. And I deal with this through absolute uncertainty and always trying to keep my cup open to more and more knowledge and to be more and more curious and to keep questioning and questioning and questioning things down to their core. And this ultimately came from this fear of, like, oh, if I can't know everything, how can I know if I'm being good? And if I can't know that I'm being good, then maybe there's some kind of existential punishment for not being good, in the sense of perfect goodness being something that I needed to go for. And again, this came from me as a very, very, very small child, just picking up on things just from my environment. And this is the meaning that I made of that. And it became sort of this complex of trying to expand into more and more and more knowledge. And so because I have this tendency toward expansion into more and more and more knowledge, there's been this counterbalancing force where I've always tried to differentiate myself out, to try to contract myself, to try to become rare in some kind of way in order to, sort of differentiate myself from the rest of the universe, because there was this huge fear of blending in with everything. Once you're exposed to like so much beyond your own self, it can be sort of this concern that comes up, like, how can I actually differentiate myself as an identity from everything else, so that I don't just get lost in the sauce, that I'm not just this ant floating on a rock out in space. And so those are some underlying sort of psychological mechanisms that have always been going on for me. And so in my medicine journeys, which oftentimes will, they'll bring you through different things that you need to go through in order to like heal, and in order to understand yourself better, and in order to integrate things. And so there's been several occasions in my medicine journeys where I've been exposed to everything everywhere all at once, where all of infinity is known in this exact moment, and I'm experiencing all realities simultaneously. Almost like if you could imagine like a movie that's reflecting in front of you that contains all other movies, and it's like every single scene has nothing to do with the scene before it or after it. And mind you, I've experienced some pretty intense experiences in these journeys. I've experienced ego death, and that's quite scary because death is an intense process to go through. But this process of just being bombarded by the everythingness of everything and infinite knowledge is just so fundamentally overwhelming that it's like the fear of that was like 1,000,000 times more than the fear of death. And essentially, when you're being inundated by infinite realities and infinite knowledge, what ends up happening is that through that infinite expansiveness into these things, everything loses its meaning. And this helped me to realize that limitation is actually the birthplace of meaning. And so that's why when you have an infinite library, nothing in the library can actually be meaningful, because you actually have to have finiteness to create meaning. And in fact, next week, I'm going to be creating a video about the topic of limitation and contraction and the embrace of finiteness. And I'm just going to share with you one of the experiences of being inundated by infinite knowledge and infinite experience. So in one of the ceremonies that I had done, I had set the intention of answering the question, do I seek enlightenment, or do I seek to be anchored more into the experience of being emerald and embrace the finite life and embrace being human? And I'd really been on the fence about that question for about 10 years before then, because I had had 10 years prior some transcendental experiences, and I thought, well, maybe it's like I should be seeking enlightenment and to seek to transcend all the finite human stuff. But then there was also so much that was pulling me back, and like almost like a preference coming through to live the finite human life. And so I set this intention, and once I took the medicine, I waited for it to have the impact. And what ended up happening is that I started to recognize that I was dying, and that there was nothing that I could do, that I was just dying. And I didn't even know if it was like dying, oh, this is part of the journey, or dying, oh, I really am dying and it just happens to be happening right now. And so this dying was, the way that I could describe it, it felt like being pulled behind so many different veils. Like, that's just a metaphor, but that's sort of what it felt like. And as I would die, I was just letting go, and then there were certain things that I couldn't let go of, and I had to let go of the fact that I couldn't let go of those things. And so there was this process of basically Emerald being a finite person who existed, to Emerald and the entire reality that Emerald had ever existed in blew away like dust in the wind, where there was nothing left of Emerald, and there was nothing left of the reality that I had inhabited. And so the experience of ego death was really just the experience of, look, let's say if I had the book of my life and that book of my life got tossed into the fire to reveal a great empty consciousness and nothingness. But then seemingly simultaneously, mind you, it was outside of time and space, and so I don't really understand from this version of myself how this was really working out, that there started to be this sense of things re-arising, and it was like the everythingness re-arose, and then there was just this consciousness that was taking in the everythingness, and this consciousness was taking in everything everywhere all at once. Every single thing that did exist or will exist or currently exists in any dimension of reality, no matter how small or finite, even a speck of sand, was suddenly known all in one moment, always existing there eternally. And being with that, this consciousness could pick up on an infinite suffering along with the infinite expanses of everything it was taking in. And it was grieving all griefs, and it was suffering all sufferings. And this point of consciousness is the same point of consciousness that I typically experience as being behind my eyes as emerald. But there was no emerald there. There was nothing that resembled emerald. It was just pure consciousness taking in the infinite expanses of reality and experiencing and loving it at the deepest level possible. And when it would recognize the presence of infinite suffering, it would have this really, really strong negative reaction where it would resist the infinite suffering. And what happened is that there came to be a split within this one consciousness, where there was the part of the consciousness that was resisting the suffering, and then there was this other part that was perfectly fine and could experience everything, and it started to wrap around this element that resisted the suffering. And in that moment, it alleviated all suffering, and there was relief that this aspect of itself experienced. But then, of course, because it's infinite suffering had to re-arise. And so this aspect of itself would again have this really, really negative reaction to the infinite suffering. And so it would once again wrap around itself, and it would alleviate all of the suffering and all of existence over eternity, but then it would re-arise again. And over the course of eternity, this kept happening over and over and over again until this consciousness that had already slightly split off from the rest of it tapped out and said, I can't do it anymore. This aspect of itself couldn't handle being with the infinite, couldn't handle accepting everything, couldn't handle accepting infinite suffering. And so out of mercy toward itself, this aspect that could handle everything allowed this aspect to recreate the idea of emerald. And then this aspect started to kind of re-imbue the experience of emerald, and I was reborn again, back into the ceremony 15 minutes later, which felt like an eternity later. And in this, the medicine showed me the purpose of my life and why it is that I exist. So it was this sense that there was an aspect of the infinite consciousness that did not want to be infinite anymore and preferred to be finite, because there was so much suffering associated with being aware of and resistant to infinite suffering. And so what it enabled itself to do out of mercy toward itself is to create a finite form where that finite form could be infinite, living this imperfect life of being this person who has a beginning and an end, and that doesn't have to be responsible for infinite suffering. But it also allowed it to have this experience where its life purpose within this finite experience could be about alleviating suffering, and gave it certain tools to be able to do so. So the purpose of my life was mercy through contraction, mercy through finiteness, mercy through embrace of the finite experience of being just this imperfect human that's born and will die one day. And so I had gotten my answer when I had asked the question of, should I seek enlightenment, or should I seek to embrace the experience of being this imperfect, finite person called Emerald? I resoundingly got the answer to the second one, where the experience of seeking more and more information, more and more knowledge, or even seeking toward enlightenment is moving me almost in the opposite direction, the place that I had originally come from, when that's not really the correct direction for me to go in. And so in the experiences that I've had with my other medicine journeys, occasionally it'll again put me back in this space of exposure to infinite knowledge and infinite experiences of many different realities all happening at once. And it is so overwhelming and so terrifying, and also so very out of alignment for for this experience, for the intention for this life. But what's interesting is that even outside of my medicine journeys, this dilemma of the infinite library or infinite knowledge or infinite expanse into things comes up again and again in my life. Even the fact that I live in a world that's constantly inundated by all sorts of information from social media, and that's also like my own, a big part of my life purpose is to kind of be on YouTube, where it's just like so much information is uploaded constantly. And so it's this sense of the constant inundation of information is like part of what maybe erodes down meaning for me in my more finite, just human life experience. So to give an example, and mind you, that experience with the medicine happened when I was 30 years old, but back when I was 21 years old, I had gotten this idea to create this art project for my BA portfolio class. So I was in art school at the time, studying to be an art teacher, and all of the art students have a BA portfolio class, which is their senior class, where they have to display their work in like the on-campus museum, and you have to create like a series or a concentration of pieces that like all relate back together, so that people can see it, at the end, and that's like what your grade is for the class. And so the idea that I had gotten and the idea that I had chosen to do is that I wanted to do a lot of paintings, so 29 paintings. And what I did was I went around and I filmed people that I knew from around campus, and I waited until they noticed me filming. And whenever they would have the reaction where they would notice me filming, I would take that few frames of the animation. And the idea was that I would create these large paintings that the backgrounds were all very different and the painting styles were all very different, pushed as far away from one another as possible. But I would try to have it still look like, the person turning around and noticing that I'm filming them. And so basically it was just like a lot of different imagery, like flashing. And I got through this in a few months, so it was a few months long semester. And so I had done these 30 paintings or 29 paintings. And by the end of it, I just felt really disenchanted with art. And art used to be at the center of my life from the age of 15 to like the age of like around this time, where I found so much meaning in art and so much meaning in image. But it was almost like in this experience, because I aimed toward expansion into so many different types of images, something about it just really soured me to art. And I started to just feel like art was meaningless and like I couldn't connect to it in the way that I used to. And that's because I think I had gotten into this space of like, it's almost like all art images had lost their meaning. I had seen too many art images, I had created too many art images, and so I'd gotten into this hyper expansiveness to the point where meaning was stripped from things. And so again, it comes back to that sense of like, in order to have meaning, there has to be limitation. So limitation being the birthplace of meaning. And so I haven't really been able to connect with art in the way that I used to ever since I was 21 years old. And recently I felt similarly about my YouTube channel. It's like now that it exists within, over the past couple of years, with just the infinite expansion of constant uploading of information. And mind you, it used to be like that before, but there's something about the way the algorithm operates now, or there's something about AI existing, and given that you can create all sorts of images and all sorts of content in like a split second, that it's like almost there's this kind of like watering down of meaning. And so what used to be incredibly meaningful for me relative to my channel and the perspectives that I'm sharing, it's hard to click into that sense of meaning, because it's almost like if something doesn't differentiate itself from the expansiveness of everything, or even if something does differentiate itself, but let's imagine that there's one pixel that differentiates itself in a whole host of other pixels such that it looks like a bunch of TV static, it doesn't actually stand out and it doesn't have meaning. And I think it's because there's this deep belief that I have that something has to be rare and stand out to have meaning. And so this idea of like the infinite library and infinite expansiveness really creates kind of a conundrum for me, where I have to figure out how can I, in an infinite universe with infinite information, find meaning when it doesn't have to do with differentiating myself in some way, when it doesn't have to do with being different than everything else, because that's always been the way that I've found meaning in the past. But with regard to the idea of the infinite library, the idea that the purifiers had of destroying the books that were just pure gibberish was a misguided idea. And there was even an idea that was shared by Merlin on the video that I watched last night around like even the most like unintelligible of those books, that's just a bunch of random characters, have some angle you can look at where you can find meaning from it. So it's a matter of like narrowing your aperture, creating limitation in such a way that even if your book is a book of gibberish in like, let's say, an infinite library of other books of gibberish, that there are angles you can look from where you can always find limitation and you can derive meaning from that limitation. And so I had mentioned several videos back that I was going through this process of kind of shedding and renewal and trying to figure out, how to relate to life in a way that feels meaningful. And in many ways, it's almost like life has become like a piece of gum that feels like it's been like all the flavor's been chewed out of it or something like that. So it's like, how can I find meaning in this like sea of infinite expansiveness? Finding a lot of meaning being a teacher, but it's like, how can you find meaning being a teacher when there's so much information out there? And even though I don't usually share a whole bunch about my own experiences on this channel, I figured I really wanted to share this because I figured that most people are probably going through some version or another of this, given the exponential expansion of everything that's happening in our world, especially of information. And I think even the existence of AI gives us a really interesting perspective to look into. It's like when it's the case that, let's say, everything already exists or something else can like do what it is that we're aiming to do, and it's like it could kind of make us go into like a kind of utilitarian redundancy. And so we have to think about other perspectives beyond utilitarianism to think about, okay, what is it about my existence that's actually meaningful? If it's not about the work that I'm doing, where is the meaning in that? And so because everything is so much and constantly expanding, I think we'll all kind of end up in a situation where some kind of meaning will be lost. But then I think that there's a lot of opportunity to find more meaning and deeper meaning and more profound meaning through this shift, because the immediate thing isn't possible to identify with anymore and possible to find meaning in anymore. And so if we all recognize that we are just a random book in the infinite library, and all of us are some of the unintelligible books with just collections of random letters that don't even make a single word. If we look at ourselves this way, and then we try to find meaning in that anyway, trying to look from angles where we can suss out different codes or different like ways of looking about the text, I think that that's going to be a really interesting perspective, or a really effective perspective for being able to mine meaning in sources that we wouldn't typically find meaning. So I'll leave you with some questions to contemplate. So the first question is if everything is infinitely expansive and you are just a small speck on like a planet floating out in space, and there's nothing that really differentiates you from anyone else in humanity, how can you find meaning in that experience anyway? If you don't find meaning through divergence or through rarity, how can you find meaning? Another question to ask yourself is, how can you find contraction in a world of infinitely expanding images and knowledge? So the purifiers had kind of the right instinct when it came to destroying those books, because they could sense that the collection needed to contract. There needed to be some form of contraction in order for those books to be meaningful. But the way they went about it was through destroying the books, burning the books. But instead, they could actually take that instinct to seek contraction and find meaning through contraction in other ways. Again, is there a certain way that you can limit the reading of the text? Like, I was just thinking about an idea of like, if you had a book that was like just purely filled with like a bunch of random characters, and that book represents your life, is there a way for you to set certain rules about how you relate to the text of the book? Like, maybe it's the case that you can only like circle like, let's say, letters that are in a certain sequence, and maybe you can start to make intelligible words out of that. And so there's ways to contract your aperture relative to this metaphor and relative to what it represents in reality, such that you can mine meaning and find meaning in those things. And another question I would recommend you contemplate is to think about, like, what angles are you going to use to sort things, to sort what's meaningful from what's not meaningful. So meaning is a dualistic concept. It doesn't exist in the absolute, and it is purely a human construction, and it exists within the minds of every individual human. It's why someone can find something incredibly meaningful, but another person could find it totally not meaningful. And so meaning requires meaninglessness in order to even exist. So it's a dualistic concept existing only in the realm of duality. And so you have to figure out, what is it that's meaningless to you and what is it that's meaningful to you by contrast. And so, like I said, I had always created that contrast through trying to become more rare or more special or to differentiate myself. But that sense of rarity doesn't help when it's all TV static, when there's so many images and there's so much information and there's so much going on, that even if you did something incredibly outlandish and the most rare thing that somebody could do, you're still going to blend into the sauce no matter what. And so for me, finding meaning through rarity is no longer possible. And so I have to figure out, what is it that's meaningful to me beyond rarity, and what is it that's meaningless to me beyond commonality, and how can I find things that are common more meaningful? And so maybe that's your thing and maybe that's not your thing, but trying to figure out, how can you create a sense of, this is the meaningless thing and this is the meaningful thing, so that you can lean into that sense of meaning. And overall, I just recommend thinking into the premise of this short story more generally. It's a very interesting concept, and there's so much that can be explored there in terms of what you as a finite being, what your relationship is with the infinite, and specifically infinite knowledge. There's also a website that exists that's programmed to sort of exemplify what the Library of Babel is all about. And so you can essentially generate any kind of collection of characters, and you can kind of pull it out from the archives. And the same thing, it goes with images. There's like, it's either the same site or a different site, but you can basically like pick out any collection of pixels that exist within a finite parameter. So for example, if we think about like Photoshop, and like, let's say that you have a collection of pixels, it's, let's say maybe you have 10,000 pixels, and then there's maybe, of the Pantone colors that are on there, maybe there's 1,000 different Pantone colors that you can choose from, probably more like 10,000. And so basically each one of those pixels can only ever be like one of those Pantone colors. And so every pixel space has 10,000 possibilities. And then there's so many different possibilities of all the different probabilities of how those pixels can be arranged and what colors are in those pixels. And so similar to the idea of the Library of Babel, every image that has ever existed, could ever exist, could ever be seen, exists there. So you could potentially like look into the image of you being born in exact 100% accuracy, and that image could exist within this collection of pixels. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll find those websites, or that website, and I'll link it down below in the description if you want to check it out. But overall, it's just a really interesting, thought-provoking idea, and it's something that I'm going to sit with a bit longer to see if I can sort of tease any more insights out of it, and I recommend you do the same. But anyway, that's all I have for you for now. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead, click the like button down below and subscribe, and leave me a comment down below. And if you would like a free resource, which is the 5 reasons for self-sabotage, and this is great for anybody who has a certain goal that they want to reach, I highly recommend checking that out. I have the link down below in the description box where you can get that free resource. And if you would like to learn more about sort of exploring the depths of yourself, go ahead and click this video right here. And until next time, keep becoming more you.